Hello, this is the coaching video for those who be leading, facilitating, teaching an on-campus small group that's going to meet on Sunday, April the 12th. So if that's you, you got the right spot and the right coaching video. So let's go ahead and get started into this. We're going to be starting a new series this Sunday that out of the book of First Peter in the New Testament. We're going to be working our way through that book over the next several weeks and leading into the summer. And so as we do that, we're also going to be studying some of the, in our own and off-campus small groups, we're going to be looking at some passages of Scripture and doing some studies that will complement and help us take what we're learning there on Sunday morning and putting it into to our lives in a way that it gets worked out. So as always, we kind of make those things fit together, and that's what you're going to find out as we get started this Sunday. Didn't we have a great Easter celebration Sunday? It was just a wonderful time of gathering together. Many people were on our campus, had a great group of volunteers that did so much to help us be able to share the gospel with so many, and appreciate all that each and everyone did and being a part of that. Here's what we're going to do on the coaching video. We're going to basically have three sections to it. I'm going to kind of do a little overview, get us started by having a little bit of overview of what we're going to be looking at, kind of share a few things about the text, and then a wrap-up time there for us. Now, in this, I'm not going to really go through it page by page or section by section. So get that. Go ahead and print out that lesson that you hopefully got a manuscript with the attached with the link for this video. Go ahead and print that out, get your Bible in front of you, and let's just kind of talk our way through some of that. Maybe you can take some notes as we go along and jot some things down that hopefully will be helpful for you as you prepare to teach and lead your small group. Now, we're going to be looking at a passage out of Philippians chapter 3. We're going to be focusing on verses 12 through 16. But really, we'll be looking at that section, chapter 3, verses 12 through the end of the chapter, verse 21. And what I want to encourage you to do in your personal preparation is go back and read through several times the the chapter in its entirety, because that helps you get a better feel of what exactly is happening in these particular verses, and what Paul is helping us helping understand what Paul is saying, and getting a grip, getting a real good understanding of that whole passage, and that's what context is always about. So let me encourage you to read through that, and read through it several times there in that. Book of Philippians is written by the Apostle Paul. It's written while he was actually in prison in Rome, or under prison guard. And he writes to this church at Philippi that he helped found some years before. It was a church that was located in a city that was a very thriving commerce city. It was on a trade route, and so there were a lot of folks in and out through the city. A lot of good things were happening there economically, but it was also a city that had a great spiritual need, and Paul helped plant a church there. The church was growing and developing. And many people have said that the book of Philippians is actually a thank you note in some ways, because in that, Paul is expressing gratitude for how they have contributed to his ministry and contributed to helping him personally, as well as helping him in his task of getting the gospel to all people. And so we see that a lot. There's a theme of joy that's throughout the book of Philippians, as he talks about the joy that we have in Christ and how that joy gets worked out of our lives despite what's going on in our lives. And so those are some of the things that are there. And in chapter 3, really Paul is challenging us to think through where we are in our relationship with Christ, as far as how we are growing to be more and more like Jesus. And the overview is really, that's what we're kind of want to talk about for just a few minutes, because as we go through this series in 1 Peter, we're going to be focusing on what does it look like to live on earth while anticipating heaven. We'll see that mentioned several times in this book of 1 Peter. It talks about we are aliens and strangers on this earth, and that really our heaven, that our home is heaven, and we're just kind of passing through here in a sense of a journey. We're passing through this earth to reach our ultimate destination of heaven. And in Philippians chapter 3, that's really what we're going to help us understand that too. And thinking about that, I want to consider you to focus on this moment, because it is easy for us to get caught up in the life that we live here and now. And rightly so. There's a lot of responsibilities that we have. There's things that we are obligations that we have, commitments that we have. We live in this world, and so we must operate in this world. But the ultimate goal is not this world. It is in heaven. And in verse 21 of this passage that we're looking at, it drives that point home there, where it tells us that or verse 20, that we are citizenships, that our citizenship is in heaven. It's not here on earth. And so there are those responsibilities we have. Our ultimate loyalty, our ultimate duty lies to heaven. And we'll kind of talk about that in a few minutes. But back to that overview, because in this passage, what we're going to be talking about is, well, what do we do when we're here on earth? If our ultimate goal is in heaven, then what are we to be doing here while we're on earth? And one of those things that we're to be involved in is what we call sanctification. And sanctification is part of our overall salvation experience. And sanctification is simply this. It's a big theological word, which means basically this. It's the process of becoming more and more like Jesus. It's growing up in our faith. It's becoming mature in our faith. And the maturity of our faith is not just knowing more about God and knowing more about Jesus, knowing more about the Bible. Maturity of our faith is that being worked out into our lives so that we are transformed, so that there is a change in how we think. There is a change in how we live. There is a change in our commitments, and a change in where we're putting our loyalties and our devotions, so to speak, there. And as we do that, we're going to find out that sanctification is that which takes time. It takes time for that process to be worked out. It takes understanding for that process to be worked out. And it takes obedience for that process to be worked out. So it's kind of a little bit of an overview of what we're looking here in Philippians chapter 3. Now, let me also say this as we kind of jump into the text, and I'll share a couple of things there. Be sure and notice those teaching tips, those little graded or shaded areas there, gray shaded areas. Some good thoughts in those teaching tips, I think, that will be helpful for you. Also, the illustrations there. There are several good illustrations that are placed in the manuscript there for you to consider using in your own small group. In the text, we're going to focus on verses. We'll be looking at verses 12 through 21, but the focus is on really those 4 or 5 verses first verses of that passage. And as I mentioned before, verse 21 drives this point home about that our citizenship is in heaven, that ultimately our loyalties, our devotion is with Jesus. Verse 12 tells us that God's desire is for our sanctification. His desire. If you want to know what God's will is for your life, here's a real simple one. God's will is for you to become more and more like Jesus. And that's what he tells us there in verse 12. And in verses 12 through 14, there's some things that he talks about there in his own life, in giving examples from his own life and walking this process in his own life to help encourage those that are reading it then and now. And one of the things he points about is in this sanctification process, we're going to have to be aware of where we are and where we need to be. Paul knew about all of where he was. He talks, in fact, in the first part of that chapter, he talks about his great achievements and it's about his personal accomplishments. He talks about his heritage, his nationality, and then his personal heritage, and all those things that people would look at and give a thumbs up to him. But he also recognized that even with all of that, he had not yet arrived, and even with all the things that he had been involved in, he still hadn't gotten there yet. He was still in process, and in that, he also helps us understand for us today that we are still the same way. We're constantly in process of becoming more and more like Jesus. He knew he hadn't got there, but he also knew where he wanted to be. And the goal that he had for his life was heaven. And the goal he had for his life was heaven, not simply because of what he would receive when he got to heaven, but because heaven was about God's kingdom. And it was not so much about what heaven had to offer to him as much as, if I can say that, as much as that heaven is where Jesus is. And his goal was for heaven. His focus was on heaven because that's where Jesus is. And his desire was for Jesus. And that's when he talks about the prize of heaven. The prize of heaven is Jesus. And that's why he speaks there about that his goal is is for heaven because Jesus is there, and his goal is to be with Jesus. And by the way, there's a statement in there I think that you ought to pick up on. It says, you never know how to get somewhere till you know where you are going. And if you don't know what your goal is, if you don't know what your destination is, then you're not going to be able to figure out how to get there. There's another thought I would give here for you too out of that. Realize that and I mentioned this earlier, that sanctification doesn't happen all at once. It is a process. It's a progression. It's a transformation that takes time, and Paul points out it in his own life and encourages them as well. And that's something I think is be important for your class members to realize, because there's sometimes we forget that. We think that it ought to be instantaneous, and if it's not instantaneous, then we grow discouraged, we grow defeated, we say, why even give it a try? Or we think we have arrived and we're there when really we're still on that journey, and there's still that which needs to be done in our lives. And one of the things that might help you on that is to notice the difference there in your teaching transcript that talks about the difference between goals and resolutions. I think that could be very helpful for you in thinking that through as well. And then there's a final statement in there I think that's very important, that if you don't take steps, you will never get there. In other words, there's got to be some obedience. There's got to be some moving forward. Paul emphasizes that throughout. He uses some athletic metaphors to help us understand that. And in the athletic the arena of athletic competition, there's something that's very important. There's got to be a commitment. There's got to be a discipline. There's got to be a sense of getting better and moving forward. And that's what Paul is emphasizing here. And especially when we read that statement, it's if you don't take steps, you will never get there. It brings to mind to me a passage out of the book of Joshua, when Joshua was getting ready to lead the nation of Israel into the promised land, and they had to cross over the Jordan River. And in Joshua chapter 3, verses 14 through 17, it talks about how they were able, this probably 2 to 3 million people were able to move across the Jordan River. And the way they would do that is the priest had to take a step forward. And when they stepped into the Jordan River, the water stops flowing. God opened up a dry path for them, and they were able to move in to that which God had promised them. And it all began by taking a step. And the same thing's true in the process of sanctification in our lives. Our transformation is going to take place by taking a step of obedience in this area, a step of obedience in another area. That's why it's important to have goals in front of you, that you are moving towards that goal. You may not have taken hold of it yet, just as Paul has said, but he was constantly moving towards that. To wrap it up, just a couple of thoughts here for you in thinking through this lesson as you work your way through it. Basically, you could wrap it up with this thought, or it does for me anyway. What or who you focus on is what you become. What or who you focus on is what or who you become. That's why Paul said our citizenship is in heaven. Our focus has to be on heaven, not so much for what heaven has to offer us, so that's very important. But our focus is on heaven because heaven is where Jesus is. And that's who we want to be with, and that's who we want to be like. And as you value him, and as you value who Jesus is, and your values become shaped by him, because you see, what you value determines what you become. And when you value Jesus more than anything else, when you value Jesus above all else and above all others, then you're going to become like Jesus. Hey, don't forget your application moment. There's a handout for you in that. There in the material, the manuscript, you're probably familiar with that by now. And don't pass that by. Use that in your small group discussions and in your teaching time. Let that help you, because, see, that's what we're talking about. The application moment is part of the transformation, the sanctification process. It helps get us moving, taking that step, that first step, or taking that step towards becoming more like Jesus. Have a great time studying with your group. Appreciate what you do, and appreciate you being a part of that. Hopefully this has been helpful to you. Go through that memory verse together. Encourage people. Encourage your small group members to be hiding God's word in their hearts. Have a great time together. And God bless.
Well, what I'm ashamed of tries to hide and tell me that things are fine just the way they are. I'm so afraid